Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're live again, and today we will be focusing on the importance of communication in mitigating and managing climate-induced relocation. And with us today, we have a professor at the Portland State University in the US. And welcome, Jola. Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Thank you, Taku, and thank you for the invitation to be here with you and with people listening. My name is Jola Ajibade. I'm an associate professor, actually. I'm an associate professor at Portland State University here in Oregon, which is where I am right now. And yeah, that's the short version of my introduction. Would you like me to give a longer version?
That would be fine. That would be fine because you've already sent part of your introduction in advance during the build up to this interview. So maybe the first question I would like to ask you is why did you become interested in climate change research?
Yeah, that's a big question, and by big I mean it's a loaded question because my interest in climate change it stems from multiple angles. One of which was a personal issue, which I'll talk about, and there is also obviously the academic aspect of it. So I'll talk about the personal side of things first. I would say my interest in climate change is actually connected back to my brother. Prior to working on climate change, I've often worked on human rights, especially human rights and anti-corruption issues when I was in Nigeria. And I've also written about economic and social rights in the context of the United Nations work. But my interest in climate change stemmed from the conversation I had with my brother, who was ill at the time. He was here in the US, he was in Atlanta, and he had cancer. And he was worried about what we were doing, not just to the environment, but what we were doing to our own bodies, like our own, bodies that we carry around, our physical bodies. And we didn't understand why or what was the root. As you know, with cancer, it's just really the human cell mutating and just changing in ways that are dangerous to a person's health. And one thing I remember he said to me was, we need to take care of our environments, and that way we can take care of our bodies, right? We can actually have a healthy body. A toxic environment also mean a toxic body. And so he asked me, he said, so what are you going to do in Canada? Because at the time I was going to Canada for a program, that's the survey program. And I said, oh, I'm going to work on climate change and anti-corruption. We're going to fight the system in Nigeria. We're going to really turn the country around, things like that, just very enthusiastic about the changes that need to happen in my country, in Nigeria, at least at the time. And he said, that's an important thing. But he said, why don't you work on something that everybody's still grappling with and, things that we don't know how to deal with? And he said, the environment is the biggest challenge facing not just one country, but everybody. And what we've done to the environment, we think about pollution of water, of the air, gas pipe leaks, things like that. And he said, we've really destroyed, at least in his opinion, and in many people's opinion, we've really damaged the natural environment we were given, whether you think about it from a Christian perspective by God. And he said, we need to think of repair, repairing the climate, repairing the environment. And I said, but I don't have any skill in environmental issues. My background was basically in philosophy and in international law. And he said, go back to school, go and learn about it. And so that was what motivated me to go back. I went back to Canada at the time and I applied for a PhD program in environmental studies and geography. And well, I'm a geography professor right now. So that's the personal side of things where the advice from my sick brother actually transformed my own interest on environmental issues, but again, transformed my career as well. It's been a rewarding work working with different people in this area, trying to find out what we need to do in terms of how we can repair the damage we've done to the environment, but also how we can repair, and in doing that, how that helps us repair our own bodies and our own relationship with one another. So that's really the connection between the personal and the educational aspect of my interest in the environment.
Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that about your
Thank you.
brother. How is he now?
It died just I think a year after we had that conversation. So it died
Oh,
in
I'm so sorry.
2009, and that was the same year I got my admission to do a PhD at Western University in Canada.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah,
Really sorry about that.
thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So, in your journey in the field over the years, what kind of issues have you examined?
Yeah, so there has been a lot of issues that I've examined. One of which, growing up in Lagos, I grew up in a community, and I would say in a neighborhood that got flooded. So for my PhD work, I was interested in multiple things like most PhD students are. I was interested in the Niger Delta area and the oil pollution that was happening there and how we can stop that and address the human rights violations that were going on there. But again, I grew up in Lagos and I grew up in neighborhoods that got flooded. I was also interested in flooding. And so I really shifted my attention to flooding, in part because of it's a direct impact. You can kind of connect to some of the changes you're seeing in the climate. But then the oil side of things, that's the Niger Delta side of things, is the mitigation part of the issue, where the oil that we're burning, the fossil fuel we're burning, is actually contributing to climate change. So you can see that the connections between my interest in trying to fight the oil company, but also my interest in trying to find ways to adapt to flooding sort of come together when you're thinking about both the adaptation issue and the mitigation issue on climate change. So to go back to your question, so I do work on flooding issues. I work on coastal storm surges, which is what I did for my PhD in Lagos. And in that work, I was looking at how the impacts of especially climate-induced flooding and storm surges or sea level rise actually having an effect on different demographics, particularly women, and how were the women responding or coping or adapting to these changes, but also how existing political and social vulnerabilities that are already in the system, how does that make particular groups of people more vulnerable to the impact of climate change, but also affect their adaptive capacity in responding to those impacts. So those were some of the things that I started off with, trying to understand vulnerabilities and the socioeconomic systems or the political economy that actually engenders vulnerability for some people and resilience for others. So I was trying to study the relationship between vulnerabilities and resilience, looking at it from the perspective of climate-induced hazards and also from the perspective of communities and indeed demographics or demographies that are typically affected. And in Nigeria, women were, I would say in Lagos, I wouldn't say the whole of Nigeria, at least based on my study, there were particular groups of women that were highly affected, in part because they lived in areas that are flood prone, they live in slums, they have poor housing conditions, but they also have lack of, or should I say, they also experience the lack of access to adequate healthcare. So when you live in an area that gets repetitively flooded, you don't have the resources to cope with the flood, and then you fall ill, you go to the hospital, you're exposed to all kinds of fees that you cannot pay. Or if you're pregnant, you go there, you don't get the help you need, and then you have forced to deliver your baby at home under flooding conditions, and then that baby dies. So there were all kinds of issues like that where the intersections between flooding and gender and vulnerability really came together in the study that I did in Lagos. That was quite shocking for me as well, as somebody who grew up there. So that's one aspect of what I study. But I also study other issues about how and why people need to relocate from areas that are prone to climate change and or climate change impacts, and what resources are there to support people who are willing to relocate, and who should be relocating, who should be allowed to stay in particular areas, what are the legal frameworks that if there are any at all. There are some in some countries. What are the legal and policy frameworks that can actually allow for a meaningful and a just and equitable relocation from areas that are prone to flooding or that are prone to droughts. Many people are now studying droughts as well. So there are all kinds of climate change impacts that are happening across the world, right? And so in the work that I'm doing on climate relocation, I'm trying to study areas where are people relocating, what is shaping that relocation, who has the power to determine whether they can relocate or not, who has the power to stay in situ and say, I'm not going to relocate, right? And when people relocate from particular areas, what happens to the land after the relocation? Do other people take over the land? Do the wealthy go there and take over the land and start building this mega infrastructure or mega cities in those areas, as you would see in some of my past work, like areas like the Atlantic City, for instance? There are communities, poor communities that were relocated or not relocated, I would say forcibly evicted from those areas. And then you have the wealthy take over those land. So I try to understand both the need for relocation for particular group, but also the injustices that is embedded in climate change relocation. So that's another big aspect of my work. And a third one, which I'll quickly talk about, is also looking at cascading disasters, right? Trying to understand what are some of the disasters that we're seeing that are connected physically, where they happen almost simultaneously, where you may have a flood and then a landslide in particular areas, or you had wildfire, and with the wildfire comes poor air quality. So you have massive air pollution right after a wildfire, and then you have the need for people to either evacuate or for some people to relocate. So what are the connections between multiple hazards, and how are people responding or adapting to these changes when it comes to climate change impact and the hazards that we're seeing? So those are the key big areas of my work: resilience, social vulnerability, addressing social vulnerability, but also addressing justice issues in climate-induced relocations.
Wow, that's quite impressive.
Thank you.
So, in your view, how does climate change awareness translate into climate change action?
Oh, that's a big one. That's an important one. I think first we need to unpack that question. What is climate change awareness?
Mhm.
And and then we'll talk about the communication side. When we say, or when I say climate change awareness, I think there are different ways people become aware of the impacts of climate change, depending on who they are and the resources that they need for their survival. So if you're talking about climate change awareness, a lot of farmers in different countries, particularly in countries where there's little support from insurance, they are very much aware of the changes in climate because it impacts their production capacity, it impacts when they plant their crops. And so they are very much aware of drought or flooding. If you think about people in Bangladesh, think about farmers in different parts of the world, in Nigeria, in Kenya. So when you tell them climate change awareness, they don't need the academics to come and tell them that the climate is changing or that the weather over a span of years, about 10 years in decadal levels, have actually changed, and that is impacting their production and their livelihood. So they are very much aware in embodied way. So that's one thing to think about. So resource dependent communities, communities that depend on the land, indigenous communities that depend on the ocean and the land, those types of communities are very aware of climate change, or at least the changes that is happening where they live and how this is changing the resources they depend on. When you think about people in some cities as well, where you're seeing a lot of sea level rise, we're seeing some sea level rise, you're seeing repetitive flooding, or you're seeing wildfires, in terms of the magnitude of this event and the frequency of this event, a lot of people are also aware that things are happening. There might be a conversation whether they attribute it to climate change or not. That can be a conversation, but that we're all, or that many people are seeing these significant climatic events. It's almost not open to debate, I would say, because we're feeling it. Even the heat wave, like we experience here where I live in Portland, it was so significant that it was just out of the ordinary. And then there is the other groups of people where you live in a big mansion, right? You have, multiple cars, you go from your house to your car to your work, and you're sort of shielded from a lot of the impacts because of your wealth or because of the resources you have. And so to people like that, you may need to convince them that the climate is changing, because not much is changing in terms of their social conditions or their livelihood or access to resources. So when we're talking about climate change and communication, the question is, who are you trying to communicate to? To the farmers and to everyday people that are experiencing the impact of climate change, you're essentially preaching to the choir. They know that they are feeling this impact of climate change very viscerally. but wealthy communities, and I'm not just saying I'm not just saying in wealthy countries, but in many countries where it's essentially shielded from the political and economic crisis that is connected to climate change. They may not feel, they may experience heat wave, but not significant because you have air conditioning that is really working well, right? And so those are the kinds of people that you want to try to reach to communicate to them that even though you're somewhat shielded because of your wealth, your resources, or the kinds of community you live, these impacts of climate change is affecting billions of people in the world. And we all need to pay attention. And we all need to find a way to work together to mitigate the impact of climate change, but also to address it in terms of climate mitigation to reduce greenhouse gas emission. So circling back to your question, we need to think about strategic ways of communicating climate change and think carefully about who our audiences are and where they are in their understanding of the changes in the climate system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, in relation to climate action, seeing that we have awareness on one side, how does that kind of awareness translate into action?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And I'm going to sort of answer this in a way that maybe would help us all, including myself, right? So I'm aware that the climate is changing, right? And I think a lot of people are. But the question is, are we doing our part to mitigate not just the impact of climate change, to actually help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or other drivers of climate change, right? So think about it. We all fly, or many people, if you have the resources, you fly, I don't know, maybe 4 times a year or 2 times a year. And you know, the climate is changing, but you're still flying. We drive our cars, and we know that in driving our cars, we release a lot of emissions, and we're still doing it. We switch on the lights. Well, I hate to have my lights on if I don't need it. It's become part of me. But most of the time, a lot of people just put it on and they go do whatever, and they're like, "Oh, I forgot to put it on." So there are so many things that we've become accustomed to, even though we are aware that the climate is changing, it hasn't quite translated to changing our own action. And the question is, how do we bridge that gap between knowledge, awareness of a negative situation or a phenomenon like climate change, and the action that needs to take place in terms of what we need to do to reduce that? So there is something in the middle. And whatever is in the middle is not, in my opinion, lack of knowledge. I think it could have to do with our emotions, could be one thing, like how we, because if you're unhappy about something, you act about it. Your emotions, your habits as well, right? There are some things that have become habitual. And so in trying to change an habit, even if you know that what you're doing is wrong, but it's become an habit, it takes a while for you to break that mold. We also need to think about incentives, right? What would incentivize me, even if I've gotten into this habit of driving my car to work or something, or into the habit of, not that I do this, but I'm saying like switching on the lights, or into the habit of flying. I don't like flying because I'm scared of flying, but I do fly once in a while. But what are the incentives and what are the technologies or platforms that we can create that can serve, number one, as sort of like a carrot and a stick, right? So the carrots will be that, we having this platform like we have now to do this interview, or for conferences where we don't need to fly. I definitely like online conferences. For me, well, there is the benefit of meeting people in person, but sometimes maybe we don't have to fly all the time. So technology like Zoom, for instance, is giving us that platform to sort of rethink things that we're doing that is contributing to climate change. The ability of people to work from home. Before we had the pandemic, not that I'm happy about the pandemic, it's horrible in many ways. But also the pandemic has shifted how we think about work culture. It's made us realize that not everybody has to be in the workplace to do what they need to do. And so if you could work from home some days, for instance, maybe doing that also helps you to reduce the days in which you drive, and therefore helps you to reduce your greenhouse gas emission. So there are things that are sort of forcing us to change, but there are other things that we need to also actively incentivize people to do so that they can begin to take those actions to mitigate emissions. So I would say in multiple ways we need to think about, and I think people have written about this for sure, all of the huge angles or areas where we are releasing emissions. So that's at the individual level. And find ways to, in some ways, regulate, but also in some ways to incentivize change. Technology is doing some, but also continue to have these conversations like we're having today can also help people really bringing the issue of climate change to people's mind and reminding them that we need to change our lifestyle. We need to change our eating habits, for instance. We know that when we, animals, especially cows, chicken maybe, but mostly cows and all that, they release methane. And we eat a lot of cows, we eat a lot of meat. That also contributes to climate change. Can we eat what is healthy for us, like vegetables, which doesn't contribute to climate change? So there are big areas where we need to incentivize change and also tell people why the benefits are there and kind of find ways to make those things easy for people. But we must not think about climate change at the individual level alone. We need to think about the corporations where you have the mega pollutions, the oil companies, the industries that are producing all kinds of products that we do use. So we need to think about how do we regulate emission at the companies level as well. There are all kinds of suggestions that people have made, whether it's cap and trade, whether it's carbon tax. Some jurisdictions, like in California, I think they try to implement cap and trade measures. In some other country, I think in some other places, I think in Canada, in British Columbia as well, they also try to implement the cap and trade measures. In other countries, like in Sweden, people are talking about carbon tax, where if you tax companies and also maybe tax the gas pump, maybe that would reduce, or that's kind of like the carrot thing, right? Force people and companies to sort of find ways to reduce their emissions. So there are those combinations of things we need to do, the incentives and also the regulation in trying to get to actions that we want. But if we don't do those things, if we assume that just giving people the information that the climate is happening and it's impacting them and impacting livelihood, and we cannot think that we're going to see immediate change in action or the kinds of action we want, that has proven to be untrue, because a lot of the information about climate change, I think, there's a lot of awareness in many countries. But why hasn't awareness translated into action? It means that some of the incentive that is not there yet or is not enough. And some of the regulations we need to see, especially with companies and corporations, is not enough. So we need to work on those as well.
Okay. Circling back to one of your answers a little bit, you mentioned that there is no lack of information about climate, especially in those societies that directly depend on natural resources. And I was just thinking right now that there is a book that I read that is titled Between God and the Earth. And I've been thinking about climate change in the scope of religion and culture. So some people would say that if they don't have rains or if they're experiencing droughts or floods, they would attribute it to God punishing them. They'll say, okay, it's God punishing us. And instead of maybe changing their ways in terms of how they take care of the environment, they would rather pray. So how can we convince such kind of environments maybe to change behavior, to change their actions so that they become environmentally friendly?
Thank you. I think that's a great comment that you've made. It's true. There are many parts of the world where they are experiencing the impact of climate change, but they are not using the word climate change. They are not translating it from a scientific perspective that this is due to the physical changes in the climatic system and not caused by their individual action, or that is something that is done as a person or as a family. That's why they're experiencing drought or famine. So that's definitely true, and that's some I think can be attributed to lack of education more broadly as opposed to just climate change education. If you're not educated, you most likely will attribute everything that happened in your life to superstition, right? To faith, to some kind of God punishing you. So that's there. It could be about anything, not just about climate change. But then when we bring it down to the issue of climate change, you're right, especially when we look at those specific communities that are resource dependent, whether it's they depend on the water and they see the water as a goddess or something, or the farm, and they see some things in their farm as God blessing them. Yes, so there needs to be, I would say, number one, education broadly at the level for everyone, but also specialized education to sort of get those people aware that it's not their fault. It has nothing to do with religion. And that these impacts they're experiencing is not peculiar to, let's say, in Kenya or in Ghana. This is something farmers in Bangladesh are experiencing. In small island states, in Tuvalu, in Maldives, they experience sea level rise. So helping them to understand that whatever it is they are going through when it comes to the shift and changes in their condition, especially their resources, where it's depleting or it's droughts, where it's drier conditions or flooding, we need to inform them that, it's not isolated, like it's not you. It's really happening all over the world. What? The other issue is that I would say most of those people, those types of resource dependent communities, it's I don't know, it's not so much about what they have done. It's really what Western nations have done when it comes to releasing greenhouse gases, industrialization as a whole, and capitalism as a whole, that has really sort of massively gotten us into this miasma or this problem we're on, right? And so what we need to be communicating to these types of community are opportunities and knowledge on how they can adapt to the changes. It's not so much that they've done something wrong, as you know. It's really like, what are the resources we can make available? Are there insurance that that can be packaged suited to smallholders farmers, for instance? Are there resources from the government, that can be given, like community radio information that can help people understand that it's not religion, it's not your culture, it's just what's happening across the world, and it's due to climate change. So there is that education component, but there is also that resource component that I think is needed to support vulnerable communities and resource dependent communities that you've just mentioned.
Thank you so much. Maybe moving on to the next question, I might want to know, in our previous podcast, an argument has been made that climate change as a subject is largely academic. And this is therefore hampered by a lot of talks and very little concrete action. What policies and practices are currently in place to help broaden and impress seriousness into the climate conversation beyond managing the impact of natural disasters?
Okay, so can you rephrase the last part? Or maybe this is what I understand. So you've mentioned that people have mentioned or have talked about climate change being an academic exercise, or at least the ways in which academics have engaged it as an intellectual enterprise, as opposed to a phenomenon that requires practical actions. So how do we move beyond the rhetoric and the discourse around climate change to
Yes.
actions, right? Is that a question?
Yes, that's correct. Because if you look at climate change, you would see that it is usually framed around conferences. And people who attend conferences are those ones who are specifically invited, and these are people who are experts.
Yeah.
Yet,
Yeah.
the climate change has to be understood by someone who is out there polluting, who is out there littering.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is what I'm trying to find out, that what are policies and measures in place to make sure that they move beyond the ivory tower perspective to the ordinary person.
Yes, 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 yes. I think there are reasons, this is my personal opinion, why climate change has been framed around whether you're thinking about the Conference of Parties at the United Nations level. One reason, and I think it's an obvious reason, is because no single nation can address climate change on its own. Whether you're wealthy or medium-sized nation, not a single nation can do it. It's a challenge that requires cooperation among multiple stakeholders and among all of the countries in the world. Yes, we do need the wealthier countries to act more, but we need everybody to act. So, because of the nature of the origins of climate change, the origins of emission, and also the kinds of impacts that we've seen when it comes to multiple hazard hurricanes, floods, sea level rise, and heat waves, we're feeling this impact all across the world. And so having climate change, or at least the beginnings of the conversations around about climate change, the reason I think it has been centered around conferences is because we need to come together and speak one language. If by one language I mean speak each other's, speak to in ways that we can both understand, all understand one another, and act on climate change. So that's sort of like the reasoning behind the old conferences, just because China and US doesn't get along on multiple issues, but also on climate change, right? Or Uganda and I don't know, Nigeria needs to get it together. So that's sort of the orientation around why we need to come together. But then you're right by saying we need to move beyond the ivory tower and really get to engage with grassroots, get to engage with everyday people who are feeling the impacts of this climate change, but usually would not have opportunity to be at those conferences, especially the high level ones at the United Nations. So that is true. But it is also true that the businesses and also the heavy polluters are not part of those conferences that has been happening where change needs to occur. So I think what you're proposing is quite important. How do we find ways to not only break the silos of the conferences, where we begin to have maybe multiple conferences or multiple meetings with different groups of people and multiple ways of engaging people that doesn't have to involve sitting and presenting papers at a conference. That has to be more about, how can we work together, whether you're working with communities or you're working with businesses or corporation, and demanding action and saying, can you give me 1 to 3 steps of what you're going to do this year? Not just, at the UN level, there are expectations that countries will act and they're supposed to do certain things each year, or then within 5 years and report back to the United Nations. So you had that at the Paris agreements, and then you had another COP meeting recently. So you have those sort of guidelines of what countries should do at those levels. But when it comes to corporations or businesses or individuals, it's really left to what people want to do. And so you're right, there has to be ways in which we need to change how we engage people. There's been this issue that I've been thinking about, especially when it comes to flying, which obviously, as you know, aviation contributes a lot to greenhouse gas emission. And I was saying, wouldn't it be important if we could all have, create sort of like a global agreement, if we can, among people? I know the aviation industry may not be happy with this, but where we all have a number of flights you can take per year, and maybe you don't use your own credit. So you say you can only fly 5 times in a year. That's still a lot, in my opinion, but let's say at the minimum or the maximum, sorry, you can fly 5 times in a year. And maybe you don't use your own credit this year. You can sort of transfer it to next year, but you can only accumulate just about 10 flights within 2 or 3 years, something like that, right? So there should be sort of like a global agreement on key areas where we can either do this morally, and where we come to agreement and morally say to yourself, and maybe it's written somewhere, that if you really mean to address climate change, this is the credits that you're giving yourself. When it comes to flying, when it comes to driving, you should only drive a certain mile per year. When you've gone above that, then you have to reduce your flights, or you shouldn't fly for that year. For instance, if you flown 5 times, if people invite you to conference, you just tell them, I've flown 5 times this year, I will join you online. And if then next year I can use my next 5 credits, that sort of thing. Like, we can create those types of ideas as well, that is not just at the national or country level, but at the grassroots level, where we give ourselves credits, points, and hold ourselves up to a standard for doing that. And that way we can talk about our own individual contributions to mitigating climate change. So that's one thing, especially for those people with resources, because I know those people with resources are the ones really contributing the most emissions. But now there's the flip side to people who have no resources, right? They're not necessarily the one flying. They don't even have the visa or anything to go anywhere. They're not the ones driving, right? So the flip side for me is, how do we support those people to still live the standard of life that is meaningful to them? So as we reduce our own flying credits, for instance, so the money that I'm supposed to spend on the 6th or 7th flight, can I transfer that resources to a farmer somewhere in the islands of, I don't know, Maldives, to help them with coping with the impacts of climate change? So can we kind of rethink a social contract globally, where we reduce our consumption, especially the wealthy people, and even I would say the middle class in many wealthy countries are doing fairly well. Can you reduce your own consumption and excessive lifestyles? And some of the savings from that, let's redirect it to support people that are suffering the impacts of climate change, as opposed to just waiting on the government or waiting on the corporations to make the most difference, because they haven't. Quite frankly, the governments have failed us, the corporations have failed us. But what can we do as individuals to really change the game?
Wow. Yeah, that's profound. So, Ijola, you are an author, and in your book, Global Views on Climate Relocation and Social Justice,
Thank
you
you.
talk a lot about climate-induced relocation. And one of the recommendations of the contributors is to change communication around climate change. First, what are climate-induced relocation and climate retreat, and what are their impacts?
Yeah, great question. So, as you know, when it comes to relocation, and some people use the word migration, though I think they are different things. But in general, before we talk about the climate-induced relocation, let's just talk about relocation or even migration, right? People migrate for different reasons. You migrate for economic reasons. Maybe you think there are better resources in a particular country or city. You could go there because you want better life. You could also migrate or relocate within a particular area because you think, oh, there's a better housing there. Where I'm living right now is low lying. I don't like it. Things like that. You could migrate for educational reasons. You could migrate for marriage reasons, right? You could relocate because you're marrying somebody. So there are all of those types of relocation, and in some cases migration, that has nothing to do with climate change. But when we focus on the climate-induced relocation, this is the particular type of relocation that is often, not always, but often centered around the impacts of climate change. So I'll give you a few examples, some of which is maybe you're living in a house like we were living in Lagos at the time, where every single year you went through massive flooding. And so you had to buy things over and over. Nobody needs to tell you that the climate is changing. You decide, I just don't want these losses anymore. I have to relocate. And so you decide either to relocate within the same neighborhood to a higher ground. You could go to a house that has, 2 or 3 stories, and you move to the next level, or you could relocate to a street or different parts of the city that is elevated, that doesn't really get flooded, right? So the climate-induced relocation is not limited to individuals relocating. It could be infrastructure could be relocated. A group of communities could be relocated. Businesses could be relocated because they're experiencing repetitive flooding. It could be repetitive wildfires. It could be sea level rise as well, where it's happening too too often, and also it's intensifying, and you don't want any more losses, and you decide I do have to move. And that is actually the core motivation for your relocation. Even though there may also be economic benefits to you moving in the new area, there may be, job opportunities for you moving in the new area, but the driver of that relocation would usually be a climatic hazard. So that's what we mean by climate-induced relocation, which, or in some people call it managed retreat, some people call it planned relocation, where because of multiple impacts or a particular impact of climate change, you decide to it could be an independently planned relocation, or sometimes a government may be involved, or sometimes non-governmental organization may be involved to support people in relocating from areas that are exposed to impacts of climate change and resettling in areas that are relatively safer for this new group. So that's what we mean by climate-induced relocation. And then what's the other side to your question? There was something.
Climate retreat.
Yeah, so they're essentially the
their
same.
impact.
Yeah, okay. So climate-induced relocation, managed retreat, planned retreat, they're essentially the same. It's just that different places use different words. So in the global south, most people would say resettlement, or they would say relocation. Well, in the global north here, especially in the US, people use the word managed retreats, which is essentially retreating. That means moving away from areas that you're experiencing this impact, and then moving towards somewhere that is safe. So that's the meaning. So it's essentially the same. But when it comes to relocating, it also has its own impacts, right? So usually people don't want to leave a place where they have family ties, where you grew up, in the house where you grew up, where you have ties to the land. In case you're, let's say, for instance, for indigenous communities, they have very strong ties to the land, or even to the communities where they live. And also the land itself is also a form of resource, right, that you're used to. And so the idea that you have to relocate from a place that you love, that you have spiritual or physical connections to, has its own impact on you, right? As a person, it can have, a visceral response for people like, no, I don't want to go. I love this place. But then the place you love is getting torn apart by climate change. So that's one issue. So there is that issue. So even when you then decide, I do want to leave because of the impacts of climate change, the question is, the place you're going to, is it safer? Are you going to have the livelihoods that you want in those areas? Are you going to have the job? Are your children going to be happy there? Would that be a place that your future generations of your family would like to grow up in? The house that you're leaving behind, is it going to be given back to nature as a sacrificial zone, or is it going to be taken up by this mega rich people? Or what's going to happen to that land? Are they going to sell the land and give you the money? So there's so many issues embedded in the relocation process that it's not straight cut about just moving people from point A to B. That's the simplistic idea. You can move because of disaster, but there's a lot of baggage that is behind that idea that it's not always easy to just overcome. We have to find ways to make people build new rootedness in the new location that they're moving to, build new relationship in the new location, find new connections to the land, jobs, and also find ways to mitigate possible hazard that could occur in those new locations. As you know, there is nowhere in the world that is exempted from the impacts of climate change. Even just today on the news, there was I think a paper came out about how the Arctic is actually melting faster than many other parts of the world, than many other oceans, and that it's 4 times, I think they said it's 4 times hotter than many other places. So even the Arctic, that you would think, shouldn't have so many impacts from climate change, is actually one of the places that is feeling the impact more in terms of the rate of the ice that is melting. So the story here is that there isn't anywhere we will move to that we wouldn't experience some impact from climate change. The question is, how do we mitigate the impacts in the new location such that it doesn't become something worse than where you're relocating from, and such that people would not have to relocate multiple times as well.
So, what communication methods should stakeholders use to engage each other on climate-induced relocation?
Communication methods. Oh, that's an important one. I think, um, hmm, I think it depends on who you're communicating to, right? So if you look at it, if you want to communicate climate change just as a phenomenon to a child, there's a way you talk about it. You have to talk about it in the ways of something that is important to that child. You have to do it in a playful form, right? You have to let them know, when you go out, it's a little hot. Why do you think it's hot? Things like that. So it's the same thing when we're talking to different stakeholders. If you're going to communicate to a business and say you need to relocate your production company from this area to another area, you have to speak the language of economics. You have to kind of tell them, by relocating, you reduce the losses that you experience, whether it's from flooding, but you're also able to increase your productivity and maybe your profits. So that's the language that businesses understand, the money language. When it comes to communities, especially communities that have ties to land, you have to kind of speak to them in the language about how will they build new rootedness in the place. How will they, retain their identities in the new place? How will they retain their language, their culture? How can we ensure that those things would not evaporate if they relocate to a new place? So that's a different kind of conversation as opposed to if you're talking to a business or if you're relocating a transportation system. There's a different kind of conversation you'll be having with transportation agencies compared to residents. So depending on who you're talking to, your conversation about what matters to them and the longevity of their interest is, I think, how you need to be talking to them. So there is no one mode of communication I would say would work for everybody. There has to be different ways of communicating. So number one, different messages. Number one, so different messaging to different people, but also different ways of communicating it. For some groups of people, they understand things in graphic arts, right? Showing them different graphics of what could happen. And some people, it's really technology, showing them technology that could help them adapt in new places, right? For some other people, it's storytelling, right? So you have to kind of think if you're a person who is a communication expert, you have to think about number one, your messaging, make sure you got the message right. But you also need to make sure that the mode in which you're transpiring or transmitting that message is a mode that the receptor can understand and therefore act upon. So that's also important. And I think a third thing that could be important is also trying to be innovative about it, right? Some people like music, right? Can we talk about climate relocation in musical forms? Some people like drama sketches, right? Movies. Can we create more movies that will connect to people in ways that would really make them to act to really address impacts of climate change in different areas? So we need to sort of come at this issue of communications in ways that are innovative, but it also in ways that really touches the heart of people, but it addresses their fears and their worries as well.
Wow. Wow, you've really explained it in a very simplified way, especially when you talked about things like music, dramatizing it
Yep.
i- instead of the subject remaining hardcore. It becomes something that is very much palatable to different
Yeah.
sections of the society.
Yeah. Something they
So,
can do.
oh, sorry. Related to that question, how can stakeholders use communication to better coordinate responses to climate related displacement?
Yeah, you always ask very deep questions. How can stakeholders better coordinate? Is that a question? Coordinate, is it
Yeah,
coordinate?
coordinate responses to climate related displacement.
Oh, yeah. So climate displacement is not exactly the same as climate relocation. Climate displacement often occurs where you didn't act, before the disaster occurs, and therefore you may be displaced by the impact of climate change. But also some actions that the government may take may also displace people. So there's a connection between sort of I would say relocation that doesn't center voluntariness, like people's uh, willingness to relocate themselves, and therefore the government forcing them to relocate, that could also lead to displacement. So that's one thing. So the other issue you raise is the coordination of action. I think it comes back to who you need to coordinate with, right? So if there are communities in an area where they're facing impact of sea level rise, but also facing storm surges, for instance, the first coordination you need is with the community, right? Is with the leaders or the everyday people in those locations. Number one, getting the message out, but also getting a sense of what is it that they want in terms of how they will respond to the impact that they're experiencing. Some communities don't want to relocate. They want in situ adaptation, which means that they want ways in which that there can be adaptation strategies that allows them to live in the same area. So in some cases, it may not be that they need to relocate. It may be that they need to sort of change the housing structure where you rebuild the house, where the house will be an opportunity for accommodating the water, where you have the lower floor being areas that could be flooded, and then people live on a higher floor. So there are those types of houses, like even in parts of Nigeria, where you have houses that are built on stilts. But in other parts of the world, it's not stilts; it's actually a really good structural housing. But also the floor is just for maybe as car parks. Again, you don't want your car flooded, but people could sacrifice their cars, right? So we need to think about rebuilding housing in areas that get repeatedly flooded, because not all communities want to move. So we need to engage communities in terms of what do they want, right? So that's one thing about the coordination side, coordinating with the people that are essentially experiencing the impact first and getting their perspectives on what they think needs to be done when it comes to adaptation. And if they chose relocation as an option, then the question is, where would they like to relocate to? How would the relocation be planned? How quickly do they want to relocate? Do they want to relocate like within 5 days of the reporting, or do they want to relocate within a year or 2 years? So that's another thing. Where is the resources for the relocation going to come from? Are they going to wait for housing to be built in the new location site before they move? Or are they willing to move and build a house while they are there? So there are all of these technical, logistical issues that I think requires an in-depth conversation with the community that are experiencing the issue. And then the community working with the government, with the stakeholders, with the builders, for instance, with the planners, to implement the projects and the strategies that they think will work for them. And this is going to look different for different communities. Communities that are experiencing wildfires, it's going to be different in terms of how and why, when they want to relocate, as opposed to people who are going to flooding. And also the identities of the community matter. If you're an indigenous community, or if you're a closely knitted community, even though you're not indigenous, but you really have a strong ties to one another, your relocation process will look very different. So working with communities to meet their needs at the time they want it, I think is the key.
So, what are your thoughts on engaging the broadcasting media as a stakeholder in climate change communication, maybe for the global south and also for the global north? Because I understand that these contexts might be different.
Yeah, the contexts are different, but also this is an important question. So I think the media plays an important role on virtually every issue. But it also sometimes they play a role that sensationalizes the problem rather than addressing it. They just talk about it like, in a way that is alarmist, and therefore makes people feel like, well, we're all going to die anyway, so we shouldn't do anything. We don't want that kind of communication, right? We want a communication that sort of moderates the fears of people, but also inspire action, right? And so when you're thinking about media in the global south, I mean, at least to my knowledge, the few people that I'm aware of in the context of Nigeria, I know they've been engaging quite more recently and a bit more rigorously now than ever before on climate change issues. But I think to do this work well, there might be need for maybe more training as well, and how do you communicate climate change challenges without creating an alarm, but also inspiring action. That's one thing. The other thing is we need to engage. When you say the media in my mind means multiple types of medias. So we have the traditional media where it's the print media, you write about climate change, you print it, and people buy the newspaper. But we know we don't live in that world solely anymore. We live in a world where you have multiple medias, right? You have the print, obviously the TV, the radio, but we also have the social media. And we know younger people are more invested and engaged in social media than they are with the traditional media. And I think engaging both the old people, I'm sorry to call people old, but engaging the older generation with the kinds of media that they read and helping to let them think through actions that they can take in their daily lives, but also the influences they have. Because older generations, many of them are still like the ones that are, leading these corporations. Some of them are wealthy, not all, but in some countries, the older generations still control or still have a lot of power, like we have here. Our president here, Joe Biden, I think belongs to the older generation, and in many other countries, even in my country, Nigeria as well, the president is old. So engaging these powerful people, because they're old but they're powerful, right? Or older and powerful. Engaging them in ways that allow them to use their power and their resources to take actions. And I'm not just talking about the presidential level. I actually mean at multiple levels and multiple corporations will be important, but also using the media that they pay attention to. Again, there's a shift in trend, even within that generation, that people are also paying attention to other types of media like Facebook, right? How do we communicate climate change impact and possible actions through Facebook in a way that touches an older person, as opposed to just dancing that will reach younger people? So depending on the platforms that you use, you have to think about what sort of messaging and ways in which you package the messaging that would really reach the audience you want to reach. If you want to reach the older generation, TikTok, for instance, right, works for older generations. Younger generations, right? You want to reach younger generation, use TikTok, use dance, use whatever. Everybody's doing that. You want to reach a relatively older generation, Facebook works. But also how you package your messaging, right? There are some also professional groups, right, that fall in the spectrum of from young to old. LinkedIn, for instance, is where a lot of people go in search for not just job opportunities, but also information about what's going on with the climate. That's another avenue that people use. And Twitter, obviously, it's an avenue that people, especially the academic-ish people, tend to be there a lot and write and things like that. So there are multiple platforms that I think are available to us as a generation to really engage people and to engage one another in taking action to mitigate our own impacts on the climate system, but also to think through how do we continue to adapt to the changing climates that we're experiencing and the impacts we're experiencing from those changes, but also to think about how do we come together in ways that our individual action actually matters, to create a groundswell of shifts from the status quo we have right now. The status quo we have right now is consumption, consumption, consumption. You need to have a big house, you need to have a big car, you need to have shiny clothes. It's all about just showing off. And all of those things really consume a lot of fuel. It takes a lot of resources to produce the kinds of things that we celebrate today. So we need to find a way to celebrate just a modest type of life. People that reduce their consumption, we need to celebrate them because they're helping our climate. People that drive less, we need to celebrate them. We should have competition that shows really, we need it to be transparent. Like if you drove less this year, or if you, I don't know, reduce your consumption by a certain amount and you can prove it, let's give people award for that, right? As opposed to just awarding typical people just because you have, I don't know, multiple degrees or whatever, but you're not doing anything for our climate. So we need to change how our incentives work and to celebrate not the consumption lifestyle, but a lifestyle that actually reduces consumption and allows us to really make a significant effort in addressing climate change.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. Maybe we can also wrap up the interview, and I'm gonna ask you the last question uh, about the media again. Like, what are the news media getting right and wrong about climate-induced relocation?
I That's a deep one as well. I haven't been studying media engagement fully in this area. That is not quite the scope of my work, but I think it's important to see. I mean, I have a lot of I've done a lot of media interviews. I've had a lot of engagement, but I haven't studied the media per se. Really studying what they are doing. So what I'll be answering this question will be just from my personal experience as opposed to studying it and saying this is what they've been doing. I think for the folks that have reached out to me, the different journalists and media platforms that I've had to speak on those platforms, they in my opinion, they do get some things right, in terms of communicating why relocation might be important for some communities, but they've also trying to balance the communication, right? So they would interview someone like me. Sometimes they interview an everyday person or people that have just relocated. And sometimes they interview other experts as well. And they bring multiple voices together in writing the story they want to write. I think that's important. So that's something I think they've gotten right, where it's not just one person perspective, it's multiple perspective that you bring together to share what's going on when it comes to climate-induced relocation. So I think they've gotten that right. But I also think sometimes they are too quick to attribute to, and this happens to different people, to attribute everything to climate change. So you may see or you may experience a flooding somewhere. I think like we had in, is it the Yellowstone area? And then I got an email from someone and said, "Oh, flooding is it's happening here. Or is this climate change?" And I'm like, I don't know. I don't live in Yellowstone. Why are you asking about? I don't even study Yellowstone. And so the attitude of just calling, on climate experts who may not even be working on the local issue in a place, and just because a flood happened or wildfire happened and just assuming they know everything about it, I don't think that's right. I think the first thing they need to do is to get a sense and get local experts in that area and interview those people first. And then you could get, other experts that are maybe a little bit distant, but first talk to the people there and talk to experts there to get what's going on. And don't attribute everything to climate change. Before climate change became a big concern because of, especially since the 1990s, the world gets flooded, right? In the period of Noah in the Bible, if you're Christian, there was flooding. It's not climate change. So not every flood event is a climate-induced issue. Not every wildfire is a climate-induced issue. Sometimes people throw a matchstick into the forest and that ignites fire. So we need to be careful about attributing everything to climate change, because that makes people just feel that they can't do anything. And they're like, well, if everything is climate change, what's the point in acting? So in making sure that we get the information that we're sharing right and making the attribution, when it's climate change, we attribute. When it's not climate change, we talk about the human factors that may have caused the events. And we address those human factors clearly, even though climate change has a human dimension to it. But we want to make sure that when we're attributing things, we're actually attributing them to the right sources and not blaming everything on or attributing everything on climate change, because that could backfire in terms of when it comes to people taking the right action as well. So that's, I hope that I answered that question
Yes, yes.
satisfactorily. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jola, for your time explaining all of these issues. It has been a pleasure being with you here and discussing with you about climate change communication, climate-induced relocation. I really believe that those who are listening, those who are following, or those who might be able to follow up on this interview later will get the gist of the interview. And thank you so much, Jola.
Thank you, Taku. It's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
So this brings us to the end of this interview. Thank you, everybody, for being with us at this time. And please do leave your comments wherever you are watching from, whichever platform you are on, whether Facebook, whether Instagram, or Twitter. Okay, we're signing out.
Thank you. Bye.